Chapter 17. Slap, slap, slap. The waves lapped at the tiny craft incessantly. For 3 days now, José had been adrift in seas driven by the almost non-existent doldrum winds of the equator. What was it Father said in the letter? Thought José. Ah, yes. The sea is the great giver of perspective. Indeed, José thought to himself. The sea is certainly giving a generous helping of that right now. Thinking back to what led him to be alone in the middle of the ocean, in nothing more than a dinghy filled with provisions, he considered how he started these travels with the best of intentions. José was resolved in his heart of hearts that the stories of how his father died on a boat which just seemed to explode were nothing more than tall tales from the addle-brained perspectives of men who had spent more time with alcohol than they had with reality. Maybe that was true, but now he found himself with nothing but the sun relentlessly beating down on him, and a seemingly interminable span of time. Time to think back on his life. Time to second-guess all the decisions he had made. Time to regret. It was shortly after the reading of his father's letter, and the almost simultaneous death of his mother, that José decided he needed to find out the real truth about what happened to his father. He had heard the stories that supposedly came from someone's brother's employer's cousin about how the ship was destroyed, and another story saying the ship survived and returned, but some of the men fell off the edge of the world. Prior to receiving the letter from his father, José really had no desire to know if anybody had survived the voyage. Up to that point, all he knew was his father had left and didn't have the decency to come home. The letter changed all that. It gave José a window into the heart and soul of a man, his father, and let him see that Arturo was quite a lot like his son, or rather, José was quite a lot like his own father. He could now understand Arturo wasn't the monster he had built up in his mind over the years, but was just a man who occasionally suffered from poor judgment. Just like any man. Just like, maybe, his son. José could now see Arturo was, in reality, a good man, with a good heart, and a good soul. He loved his wife and child, and was only trying to be the man he hoped his son would become one day. José wanted to be that good man, like his father. That thought, along with a desire to stand side by side with his father in the eyes of history, helped José decide to finish the work his father had started, to try and complete the voyage which ended in disaster so long ago. For this to work, he knew he had to find out what really went wrong, learn from those mistakes, and do it right this time. That meant getting to the bottom of what truly happened. Did a ship actually return to port? Who survived? What happened to Arturo and Hernan, José's uncle? This meant José needed to retrace the steps his father and uncle took. Over the years, Valera carefully avoided speaking about what Hernan and Arturo did in the presence of José, but still it was impossible to keep all information a secret. There were times when Marco and Valera were talking among themselves and didn't know José was listening. This was where José got most of his information about the ill-fated voyage. Apparently, the two had left on their voyage from Azores, a coastal town, special to them for some reason. The last time José's mother saw them, they were going there to buy a boat. This is where he had to start. As was typical for him, Marco tried to help José get to the bottom of the stories about his father. José didn't tell Marco everything he planned to do, of possibly undertaking the same voyage his father had done, but he did tell him he needed to go to the fishing village and dig deep. Marco was familiar with Azores, so he told José the best places to start in his search, and what places he needed to stay away from, since they weren't safe. The worst of those places was a run-down section of a wharf called Mar de Dolores, Sea of Sorrows. José packed his things, secured enough money from the family fortune, and set out for the coast. That fortune was one legacy Arturo and his brother left for José and his mother. At least they weren't paupers. In a week, José was standing on the end of a wharf looking out over the same waters his father gazed upon 20 years earlier. Back in the present, and floating on that same sea now, José thought about the countless opportunities leading up to this moment, when he could have changed his fate. He could have lived a good life without having to be in such peril. Such a waste. Thinking again about the events that unfolded in Isurus, José remembered how he started asking questions about that voyage of 20 years ago. He learned early on it wasn't wise to identify himself as a Baragón y Cisneros. While a few in his local village spoke in hushed tones about the rumors of what happened to Hernán and Arturo, there was no such politeness on the docks. The opinions were unfiltered and harsh. When a few learned he was Arturo's son, he suffered jeering from washed-up wharf rats who had nothing better to do than to continually live in the past. José decided to go by Marco's name, and not his own, since his goal was getting to the bottom of the legends, not clearing the family name. Not yet. While Marco told José not to go anywhere near Mar de Dolores, that is exactly where his search led him. He did his best to blend in, dressing like a wino himself. He dared not let on how well-to-do he actually was. Repeatedly, questions about that voyage pointed to someone who might live in Mar de Dolores. Once he got there, he pretty quickly discovered the man, who just plain stank of alcohol. It was amazing to José this man was even alive, considering how long he'd been drunk. For some time, José observed the man from a distance and concluded that whatever led him to such debauchery must have been formidable. Finally, José approached this man in a roundabout way, hoping to eventually coax information out of him. It took about a week to get him to open up, but with a generous amount of liquor coursing through the man's veins, José was able to start getting the information he so desperately needed. José started with a reverse psychology ploy. "I don't think there was any Baragón voyage," said José, hoping to see if it would be refuted. Without altering his watery-eyed gaze, the older man expelled a wheeze. "Yeah, well, what do you know?" he slurred. José began faking his own inebriation with slurs. "I just don't think anybody went out there like that is all I'm saying. I mean, if they went out there and, stuttered José, died on a ship that sank, then how did anybody back here find out? Easy?" Closing his eyes, the old man responded, "'Cause there were 2 ships. "What? 2 ships?" "2!" shouted José, completely losing his ruse of inebriation for the moment. This is a continuation of Chapter 17. "2," replied the old man, slowly nodding his head. "2 ships. The Fortuna and the Tyche." He now started laughing without control, spitting and sputtering. "Why did they need 2? That doesn't make sense," asked José. A look of pain came rushing back to the old man's face as he looked José straight in the eyes. "You ask too many questions." José had pushed him too hard and too fast, and he knew it. That was stupid, he thought. Nah, no offense, my friend, said Jose, regaining his disguise of drunkenness. Let me make it up to you. He pushed a loaf of bread and a bowl of aioli toward the man, along with a new bottle of sangria. That gesture seemed to brighten up the old man's face. With a wizened hand, he broke off a piece of bread, dipped it in the bowl of aioli, and crammed as much of it in his mouth as possible. Jose partook in the fare as well, allowing the old man to regain his composure while they sat in silence. As he chewed slowly, Jose realized this man was the best source of knowledge he had come across. He knew things others didn't, that there were 2 ships, not just one, and even the names of those ships. Around that time, another carouser happened by and, seeing the old man was in possession of something to eat, tried to sponge a free meal. He magnanimously started talking to the old man as if they had been friends for decades, and sat down next to him with a thin smile, thin eyes, and a thinly disguised agenda. To the completely sober Jose, the social dance evolving before his eyes was easy to decipher, and he observed that the old man was apparently very familiar with the strategies. As soon as the freeloader sat down, the old man deftly moved the bread and bowl out of his reach, so that he now had to ask for some, reach over the old man, or walk away. The old codger got the hint, and once he saw there was no free lunch here for him, he quickly evaporated with the wind. As he observed the man eating again, Jose sensed another question might be acceptably received. So, 2 ships? Huh? Groused the old man, as Jose broke through the fog of alcohol and garlic. 2 ships? Why 2? Because the captains thought 2 ships would have a better chance of making it, answered the old man. The fact he tripped over his words wasn't lost on Jose, who had been drinking grape juice instead of wine to keep his mind sharp. What was this man hiding? So, were both brothers on one ship? Asked Jose. The old man closed his eyes. He didn't answer the question verbally, but as a tear found the cracks in his wrinkled face, he shook his head from side to side. Pursuing this new information, Jose decided to risk raising the ire of the old man. But if one of the ships came back, does that mean one of the brothers came back too? With his eyes still closed, the old man silently nodded. Jose quietly thought for a moment. From his father's letter, Jose knew that if Arturo could have made it home, nothing would have kept him from seeing his wife and son again. If one of the brothers had made it back, then it would have to be Jose's uncle. With eyes slowly widening with each passing second, Jose suddenly began to lose the ability to breathe. When he first sat down in front of this old man, there was something strange about him that Jose couldn't quite put a finger on. But now it hit him all at once. Jose was sitting in front of his uncle. The old man was Uncle Hernan. Coming back to the present as he floated in the middle of the ocean in a dinghy, Jose smiled softly to himself at the memory of finding his uncle. When Jose was able to gather his wits about him, he looked at the face of his uncle, really examining him. He could now see the face of the man he barely remembered. Once again, Jose's breath was taken away when he realized his uncle was an identical twin to his own father. Apart from the effects of inebriation, Jose now realized he was looking straight at the face of what his father would look like. Jose began thinking about what Uncle Hernan had been through. He had seen his brother, his identical twin brother. Wait, what happened? What really happened? He had to know. But how could he find out? He didn't want to destroy what was left of this man, a man he instantly loved and felt overwhelming pity for. How could he break it to him gently? By this time, Hernan had been examining José and seen an evolution of expressions coming over the young man. Hernan may have spent a lot of time with booze to forget, but he still could recognize what lay below the surface. He saw the young man in front of him graduate from curiosity to wonder to something else he didn't recognize. What was going through his mind?
"What's wrong? Looks like you've seen a ghost,"
laughed the old man, reaching for another piece of bread to dip in the sauce. José decided there was no delicate way to do this.
"You're not far from the truth,
Uncle Hernan." The bread was already halfway into Hernan's mouth when he stopped dead in his tracks. It would have been impossible for his eyes to get any wider, and what had already made it into his stomach was suddenly threatening to see the light of day again.
"What did you say?"
was all he could muster. José decided he might as well go all in. "I am José Barragón y Cisneros. My father was Arturo, and my mother was Valera Barragón y Cisneros. You are my Uncle Hernan." By the time the bread Hernan had been holding found its way to the floor, whatever countenance he had been using was long gone. All the blood drained from his face, and now he was the one who looked like he had seen a ghost. For Hernan, that was when it all went black. Floating in the ocean, José recalled the events of that day, remembering how his Uncle Hernan slumped over and fell right off the bench he was sitting on. Rushing to his side, José saw Hernan was still alive, but the sudden shock of learning who José was, combined with all the alcohol running around in his system, was too much to process. His mind decided to temporarily abdicate its throne. Eventually, Hernan came around, but he had a nasty headache from the blow to his head when he had fallen, not to mention the nasty hangover. The first thing he saw was the face of his nephew, which he now recognized was the perfect combination of his brother and Valera. Still laying on the floor where he had fallen, once his eyes were able to completely focus, Hernan reached up with his weathered hand and stroked the cheek of José's face.
"Joselito?"
"It's me, Uncle Hernan. I'm here."
"Oh, Joselito,"
cried Hernan as the weight of the last 20 years, not to mention the horror he witnessed that day on the sea, came crashing down onto him. For 20 years, he built an architecture of denial fueled by anger and guilt, and lubricated by alcohol. Crushing reality now pounded on the doorpost of his mind, crossing the threshold to his consciousness without permission. To have the precarious evaporate within the span of 3 heartbeats. Left Hernan with no other option than to break down into uncontrollable sobs. Whoever named this part of town the Sea of Sorrows must have known this day was coming for Hernan.
"Come, uncle, let's get you up off the floor,"
said José. José recalls it took Hernan quite some time to calm down, and even more time to get to the point where he was willing to talk. It was strange that there was an epic sense of realization and an epic reunion happening in a corner of the bar, yet other patrons had no desire to meddle in the affairs of Hernan and José. Even when Hernan lost consciousness and fell on the floor, none of the others even lifted an eyelid, let alone a finger, to help. It was as if this happened every day and was nothing special. Perhaps it really wasn't anything new for this part of town. José sat across from his uncle, waiting for him to get his wits about him. He knew his uncle had quite a shock just now, so he wanted to wait until he was ready to know more.
"Why?"
"Excuse me?" asked José.
"Why did you come?"
It wasn't accusatory in nature. It was asked in a tone indicating he just wanted to know why on earth Jose would come to this godforsaken hole. "Because you are loved, and because you are missed," was Jose's answer. For several moments Hernan didn't respond. Looking off into the distance, Hernan eventually replied,
"I don't know what love is anymore."
Jose let that sink in for a bit, then said, "I do, my uncle, and I know you are a man who is loved." With a harumph, a shake of the head, and with half-lidded eyes, Hernan responded,
"My boy, there is nothing here to love anymore. When Arturo died that day, I died."
This comment set Jose back in his chair. Leaning against the wooden seat back, he was overcome with the realization this was the first ironclad confirmation of his father's death. As Jose sat there, he realized a part of him secretly hoped Arturo was still alive. Had he been alive and not come home, that would have been a whole different set of emotions he would have to deal with. But now, Jose knew he was never going to see his father again. On the other hand, his father's identical twin was sitting right in front of him. It wasn't the same, but that offered a certain degree of consolation. While Jose was lost in his thoughts, Hernan was simultaneously lost in his own reverie. He regarded his nephew sitting before him, and, with each passing moment, was reminded more and more of the things he left behind. He strenuously tried for so long to forget about the enormous pain in his heart, but only succeeded in ignoring it. Forgetting was impossible. Hernan thought about how most would think watching your twin die would rip out half your heart. They would be wrong. Ever since he was a child, Hernan knew his soul, his very life, was completely bound with his twin. When Arturo died, everything that made Hernan a living being ceased to exist. He felt certain nobody who wasn't a twin would ever understand just how much he had lost. He knew his wife Sophia wouldn't understand completely. He knew she would see a broken man with no further will to live. She would be consoling, to begin with. That was just the kind of woman she was. But when the wound didn't heal after weeks, months, years, and even decades, he knew she would grow tired. She wouldn't go anywhere, but he knew if her life contained even a fraction of the misery he felt, it would be the worst disservice to her. This is another continuation of Chapter 17. 20 years ago, when he was returned to port against his will, without even his brother's body to bury, he knew he had to make a decision between the irresistible force of his crushing grief and the immovable object of his commitment to his wife's happiness. Either he allowed her to think he had died, and after a comparably short period of grief possibly marry again and be happy, or return and saddle her with a lifetime of heartache, pain, and misery, as she watched the shell of the man she loved wither away into oblivion. For Hernan, there was only one decision to make: to carry the burdens of his pain alone. He never anticipated he would come face to face with his history so abruptly and so unexpectedly. Jarring Jose from his own reverie, Hernan broke the silence.
"How is Sophia?"
"She is—" Jose hesitated. "Fine. When you didn't show up, she tried to look for you, but then someone told her you had been killed at sea. I remember Mother spending a lot of time with her. I was young, so I don't know what they talked about because I was always sent outside to play. But I know she cried a lot. She never did remarry. And It wasn't until 2 years ago, when I had become an adult, that she told me she never felt like you had died. There was just something in her that told her you were alive." Jose paused. "I guess she knew something the rest of us didn't." Hernan looked away. The strain of keeping his eyes open while feeling the full wrath of the retreating armies of alcohol was considerable. He now realized he couldn't keep running. He was tired of hiding behind his grief.
"I guess I thought she would move on and find love somewhere else. I was hoping she would eventually find happiness, even while I knew I never would."
"Forgive me, uncle, but then you must not have known how deeply she loved you," replied Jose. Hernan didn't answer, but simply nodded his head. Hernan continued his inquiry.
"And Valera? I suppose she stayed alone too?"
"No, she married again. She was very happy," answered Jose.
"Ha!"
retorted Hernan without thinking.
"I guess she didn't love Arturo much after all."
For the most part, Jose was a mild and gentle soul. Very little ever got under his skin, with the distinct exception of matters pertaining to his mother. For 2 decades, he had watched Valera go from being a happy wife to a distraught widow and grief-stricken mother, then finally to a hopeful and healed woman. He had seen it all, and through it all, she consistently demonstrated an inner strength which was always there for her son. In Jose's book, she was an absolute saint. Now that she was gone, this was definitely the wrong thing for Hernan to say. Abruptly standing from the table, Jose shouted, "You know nothing, you old fool!" He turned and stormed out the door of the bar. He stood outside absolutely fuming at the stupidity of his uncle. How dare he impugn the motives of his mother? She had been through so much, and in fact, she stayed single until— That's when it occurred to Jose that Uncle Hernan didn't know about the letter his mother had received. He didn't know Arturo had not only written the letter, but also had given his permission for her to remarry. The longer he stood there, the more Jose realized that, although it was a very insensitive thing to say, Hernan was a broken man who dealt with a lot of personal demons. Standing in front of the saloon with the racket of horse-drawn carts passing by, Jose didn't realize someone was standing behind him until he began to speak.
"Please forgive me, Joselito."
Jose turned around to face his uncle standing before him.
I didn't—"
"No, uncle. I ask for your forgiveness. There is much you don't know, but I am here to tell it all to you." With that, the 2 men went back into the saloon. Jose proceeded to tell the complete story about his life and that of his mother, the way she grieved for Arturo, and the way Marco came into their lives. He candidly told him how he had felt abandoned, which was hard for Hernan to hear, since he was just as guilty of that abandonment as Arturo was. He also told Hernan how he wanted to change his last name to Marcos when he was 13, and when they didn't let him, he felt abandoned all over again. Eventually, Jose came to the day when Valera died and the subject of the letter. Jose kept it with him at all times, in a flat metal container under his cloak. He produced the letter for Hernan and gave it to him. The letter was hard to read at first, but then Hernan recognized something in the words he had long forgotten. On the day when Arturo died, even though the 2 brothers were physically separated by so much ocean and circumstance, the 2 of them were thinking the exact same things. Hernan remembered sending the message to Arturo proposing that the voyage end, and in 2 days they should consider turning around. It appears Arturo was experiencing the same feelings, and he placed his thoughts in this letter. Feeling like the whole voyage was a fool's errand, or realizing that being with his family was much more important than some legacy of their father. When he came to the part where Arturo gave permission for Valera to remarry, he realized now just how stupid his earlier comment about Valera not loving Arturo was. He looked up at Jose right then, who was astute enough to know just what his uncle was thinking. Jose said, "You didn't know, uncle. You are forgiven." Hernan cocked his head now as he looked at his nephew with a new level of respect for the man. It was then the proverbial floodgates opened, and any question Jose plied Hernan with was answered. He learned about the two boats, the crew, the overall tactic of sailing west at night, and how the crew figured out the real nature of the voyage, since a couple were experienced sailors. He learned about how Hernan still felt there was a way to the coast of India by sailing west. But when it came to the death of his brother, Jose discerned this was too much to talk about, so he left that part of the discussion alone. Realizing the sun had risen hours ago, both men were stunned to learn they had been talking all night and for most of the next day. While Hernan decided he needed to sleep now at some flophouse where he was staying, Jose was far too wound up to sleep. Back on the small dinghy floating on the sea, Jose opened his eyes and realized that remembering all these events had taken most of the morning, and he hadn't paid attention to where the small craft was going. Not that there was much to observe while floating in the middle of an endless sea. The sun was high in the sky, but now that he thought about it, it seemed as if the sun wasn't as harsh on his skin. He observed to himself that the weather here was suddenly quite pleasant. No painful sun beating down on him, just its warmth alongside a cool breeze. He breathed deep, but was soon reminded of the persistent cough he had slowly started developing ever since his mother died of the breathing sickness. Secretly, Jose was hoping being at sea would help, but it only seemed to get worse. Now a sudden fit of coughing and sputtering left the already weak Jose even weaker. He closed his eyes and thought more about the events leading him to this small, deserted, but for the moment very pleasant, location on the open ocean. After his meeting with his uncle Hernan, Jose felt much the same way his father did after learning about the death of Diego. Jose wanted to complete the quest his father had tried, so that is what he did. He followed the same steps Hernan and Arturo had followed, with the main exception of using a crew that knew nothing about the sea and nothing about navigation. It was a difficult journey for sure, but eventually the crew hit their stride and worked well together. The only problem now was that Jose was getting sicker and sicker, and the crew recognized it. He tried to just stay away from them, but the crew didn't want a man who had the sickness to be anywhere near them. Suffering a similar fate as his father, the crew mutinied, setting him adrift on this small boat with food and water. It seemed his destiny was sealed, death at sea. What Jose couldn't have known was that, due to an uncanny combination of circumstances and luck, his life was spared the same fate as his father at the same location. Yet now the lives of thousands were doomed. Not far away from where Jose floated, on an island normally hidden from sight, a relatively small piece of machinery in charge of managing a force field shield around the island of New Galimar gave out. It was normal. Every 600 years, the plasma emitters used by the shield needed to be replaced. It only took about a minute to replace the unit, but during that time, the shield would be down. Originally, the shield was set up around the island because its alien inhabitants were unable to handle the harmful ultraviolet radiation coming from the sun. While the plasma emitter was being replaced, all island inhabitants knew to stay indoors. One of the unintended effects of the shield, though, was it caused anything that came into contact with it to be destroyed. This was the original fate of Arturo's ship 20 years ago. Jose just happened to be in the right place at the exact right time. When his small craft passed the position of the shield, it happened to be off, so he passed through without incident. A minute later, the shield went back on, but by then Jose was safely inside. When Jose opened his eyes and noticed the beautiful weather and pleasant effects of the sun, he didn't realize this was the effect of the shield which had been put back into place. Once inside, his boat soon struck something that felt like land. Jose turned around and discovered he had not only landed on an island he swore that wasn't there before, but was now looking eye to eye at some of the most beautiful people he had ever seen. The look of astonishment in their eyes was very similar to the look in his own. Hey fellow Galimarians, this is Dan Adrian, and I just wanted to say thank you for listening to my book. If you can, please click like down below because it really helps me bring these videos to you and lets me know what you like. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe and click on the bell so that you'll get notified when I release more chapters. If you have any questions about this or any other of my books, or if you want to know more about what it takes to write a novel like this one, please make sure you leave your question in the comments below. Thanks again. I'll see you soon.